Welcome to Rainy Day Thursday. Today, on the beginning of the last reset before the release of patch 11.0.5, which will bring quite a few changes to the balance tuning of the specs as we covered yesterday already. Today, we are then doing our last raid meta recap before the patch is going to launch. So we're going to be using this one as our metric to then check after the patch has launched to see what are the differences, what will be the changes in the performance of each of the specs, the surge in popularity of certain picks compared to others once the patch has launched. Now, this is where we left each other last week in terms of performance of the specs. This was also before the last round of tuning of the specs as well. We said we were going to keep an eye out for a few of the specs being changed after the tuning. For example, the buff given to Shadow Priest was going to be one. It is also kind of interesting to see how much things can change, as we usually point out during this period of progression, because of how few guilds, how few guilds have killed these bosses, meaning how little data there is going to be on Warcraft logs, meaning every time more and more kills come through, different types of damage profile might be empowering certain specs compared to others. And you see the difference, you see it now, this week, right now, compared to the last time we looked at it. Now we have a massive rise, for example, in performance of Assassination Rogue, right? Now they are 5th, while last week they were 16th. So they gained 11 positions in the overall rankings of DPS. What happened in 1 week? Well, nothing happened. Assassination did receive no changes in this last week. So might it have something to do with the performance boss by boss? Now that you have, for example, more results on Silken Court, we're still talking about very few results. Assassination is 6th on Silken Court. You have also even more kills of Nexus Princess, where you have Assassination being middle of the pack, for example. Then you have Broad Twister, where Assassination is in the top half. And then more kills on Rashaman as well, where Assassination is easily first. But this hasn't really been changed from last week to this week. It's mostly, we have to praise Blizzard for the difference in balance of most of the specs being quite close to each other. For example, Assassination here is towards the top, but their median DPS is 1.060 million. And then you look at something like Demo, which is towards the bottom, and that's 1.020. So it's only a 40,000 DPS difference. It is about 4% damage. So from here to here, it's just 4%. All these specs are within 4% of each other, which is quite good. It is quite balanced. You can see, as usual, once you look at the actual details, boss by bosses, the specific bosses for the specific damage profiles, you can see larger gaps. So if you look at a pure single target boss like Sikron, for example, you might start seeing larger gap. For example, the bottom part of the DPS is around 1.130 million. The top half is 1.230, 1.240 amongst this bunch. So it's around 100,000 DPS more, which is 9% more damage. But even then, being able to stay within 10% from top to bottom is still a pretty good set of results when it comes to the DPS differences. Because then, of course, when you switch from Sikron, which is pure single target, where BM, for example, is doing very well, and then you move over to Broad Twister, which is not nearly as good when it comes to single target DPS, of course, you can have massive changes in terms of damage. So right now, to be fair, the difference in the balancing and the power of the spec is quite close. It has gotten also even closer now with the balance tuning recently, for example, which buffed Shadow Priest. Now Shadow Priest has been moving up in terms of damage. But then, yeah, if you also weigh this performance by their popularity, same goes for Fire Mage, they go towards the bottom because at the moment, of course, even if they're doing well, they're not being played a lot. Fire has been growing in popularity over the past week, the past couple of weeks even. It's expected, of course, the more mage players start going in here and they keep seeing Fire here, they keep wondering what's going on with Fire. I thought everyone was playing Arcane. Arcane is, in fact, the most parsed DPS right now in Mythic, but Fire is doing kind of just as good. So it's understandable that you have more and more results of Fire over the past couple of weeks because of their good performance. Now, in terms of expected changes we might have in the future, of course, we mentioned the amount of progression of the bosses. We will have more. As you know, we have just gotten the weekly raid buff coming up. We thought it was going to be 3% more damage and healing per week. Turns out it's 2.25% more damage and healing per week. And on top of that, we have gotten more significant nerfs to Queen Ansuric Mythic, which is not that relevant for now for most guilds, but also to Silken Court being nerfed as well. And of course, we will be here to brag that we actually did kill Silken Court before the nerf. So we will use that as bragging rights, but for the purpose of logs, of course, in the next few weeks you will get more and more kills, especially of Nexus Princess and Silken Court. Nexus Princess will bring some more life to good single target specs, because Nexus Princess will have a damage profile very similar to Sikran, because it is a pure single target fight. The main difference you will find between Sikran and Nexus Princess is the fact that Nexus Princess will be a couple minutes longer. So the main difference is that mostly the 3-minute specs, which on this fight can only use their cooldowns twice, on Nexus Princess they will be able to use their cooldown 3 times. That's a better gain for those specs. But of course, as you look at the top results on Nexus Princess, you kind of have an idea of which specs will improve their overall performance, right? Most of these results doing very well on Nexus Princess are going to be Enhancement Shaman and BM Hunter in particular, as well as the not nearly as played as usual Survival Hunter, that is also doing well despite not being played nearly as much. The other one will be different, of course, because it's Silken Court. Now, the logs of Silken Court are still, of course, quite scarce. There aren't that many, considering also this level of top guilds will have often many private logs, meaning they won't show up in here. But, of course, one of the major advantages for certain specs in being able to play this boss is the fact that it's 2 bosses that share HP. So, if you can damage both of them at the same time, if you can find in your spec something to boost your damage by hitting 2 targets, you will get an advantage. And of course, here we see 2 dot specs now doing quite well in results in here. The newly buffed Shadow Priest is appearing more and more in the logs of this fight, as well as Affliction Warlock, together with the already well-performing Frost Death Knight, but that one we kind of knew already. The other advantage you could have on this fight is, of course, not nearly as important, simply because this fight is so long. You know, it's 9 minutes long, even though the DPS number you will see once you get there will be quite large. You know, we are talking about upwards of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 million DPS, because this is the phase where one boss takes double damage and then the second boss takes double damage, so you have practically 20 seconds of Bloodlust, Potion, Trinket, double damage. So some of these specs with Burst will be able to do very well, but you know, it's 20 seconds in a fight that lasts almost 9 minutes, so it won't be nearly as relevant for the overall results. So if you move over to Silken Court, Affliction and Shadow right now are the one doing the best. So if we go back to all of the bosses, as more and more guilds start killing Silken Court, naturally the overall performance of Affliction and the overall performance of Shadow is bound to become higher, as they will have much better results on Silken Court. Now, what also happened since last week was another set of very important changes, this time not for the DPS but for the healers, because we were talking about the nerfs happening to Preservation Evoker. Now, if we cut the results from just the last week, we can see the change. I know it's not that visible right here, right? But you can kind of notice it. The gap from before, the upper quartile result of Preservation was 1.5 million. The second best was at 1.8 376, so there was a 130,000 something gap between the two. Now it's 1.47 versus 1.38, so it's a 90,000 gap, which practically has almost halved compared to before, just looking at the last week. Now you can also see the good performers, the upper 90 percentile performers. Yes, the gap is still here. It's still, though, good to mention the nice balance across all specs. Funnily enough, what is considered the OP one in Mythic Plus right now is actually the one lagging behind in the raid. This is not too weird. Resto Shaman is very mana hungry in the raid, so unless your raid has a dedicated Druid that isn't a Resto Druid that can give innervates to Resto Shaman, for example, they suffer way more than the other healers. Also, compared to other specs, they suffer quite a lot when put next to a Preservation Evoker, because Cloudburst Totem is practically a very weak version of what Preservation Evoker does with Engulf, popping an AoE heal to the entire raid, which can get sniped away by a much stronger one in the case of Preservation Evoker. Funnily enough, similar to Fire Mage doing very well but being underplayed, we have the same for Discipline. Discipline is very underplayed. Very much underplayed, but their performance is actually quite good at the moment. It is mostly irrelevant simply because of how few of them there actually are. You know, if you go and start looking at the Silken Court, you're like, oh, looks like Discipline is the second best. Okay, but where is Discipline? Where is Discipline? Maybe one we can find somewhere. There you go. There's one guy doing well on a Discipline Priest in this fight. And of course, this one required practically a griefing Preservation Evoker, doing very poorly. And also, admittedly, this one being a rekill of a guild that already has this fight on farm. But definitely the most noteworthy part about the healers is the fact that now you have a smaller gap between Preservation and the rest of the healers. It's also worth mentioning, compared to what we were expecting before, we were expecting more Evokers to straight up quit Flame Shaper after the nerfs. So if we cut and only look at this post-nerf of Flame Shaper, only the results post-nerf, and we only look also at Preservation Evoker, you can still see that the choice by default remains Flame Shaper, much to the contrary of what we thought. Yes, of course, there are more and more Chronowarden Evokers now being played over time compared to before the nerfs, but in general, they're still being chosen for the way they heal, the way Flame Shaper heals. Going back to Chronowarden would mean having to change the healing timers of your heal composition, simply because Flame Shaper was doing something very unique that not pretty much any other healer could do besides a Discipline Priest. So if you wanted these windows of heavy healing that a Flame Shaper Evoker can do with Engulf, I know you don't read little squiggly lines, but trust me, this orange is Engulf. Flame Shaper has continued being used. So that is perhaps also the surprise for the week, the fact that despite Preservation Evoker losing a good amount of healing when it comes to Flame Shaper, they have continued being the, the spec of choice, the build of the spec of choice in the raid so far. The other one of the expected results, I guess, at this point, you kind of have to expect it as you start looking towards the higher and better performing results. You do still have, even if you go low to like 30 percentile results, Restoration Druid now is better than before. They were averaging towards the bottom. Now instead they actually are bang in the middle with one of the highest peaks, actually the second highest peak, upper quartile top results of healing right after Preservation Evoker. They have admittedly the best style to be paired with a Preservation Evoker, because Preservation Evoker will heal all at once in a single chunk with Engulf. So if there continues to be rot damage and dot ticking damage, what's gonna be the best one to soak up all of that healing is a hot based spec that spreads 10-15 different hots on multiple players to keep up the healing, something that no other one of these specs can do. You used to have, once upon a time, you used to have Holy Priest playing with this style, but recently Holy Priest has practically, abandoned this playstyle to instead start playing with Lightweaver, and basically just use single target healing abilities. They don't even bother even talenting. They don't even bother pretending they are AoE healing, and they just don't even talent into their AoE abilities, and instead they spam single target heals. If you look at the casts, the Sons and Sons Rapides and Massacre Serenité are what they are spamming for single target. Most of this, we have to continue to point out, is bugged. This is not what Holy Priest is supposed to be doing. It has gone under the radar completely from Blizzard. This is supposed to be cut in half. The actual results of Holy Priest would have to be closer to here. But despite adjusting this bug for Dawnlight of Holy Paladin, they did not. Blizzard did not do it for Holy Priest, so their performance with Halo healing and the mastery healing that comes from Halo healing has gone under the radar and unfixed, which gives them this very good performance so far, unlike what we thought at the beginning of the tier, the possible predictions at the beginning of the tier. And that's what we have right now for healers as well. The nerf was decent for preservation, perhaps more is needed for Flame Shaper. I mentioned, like I did when we read the nerfs, it was probably more fitting to not nerf Flame Shaper, but rather nerf a bit more the base spec rather than only Flame Shaper. But now at the very least it leaves more room for other specs to have a chance at getting closer to the healing that Preservation Evoker is currently doing, and also not making it nearly as needed, nearly as mandatory to run double Evoker because of how powerful they are on the later bosses. So it has gotten to a bit of a closer gap in balance between the healers as well when it comes to the performance in the raid. As mentioned, the performance in the raid for the DPS was already quite balanced. We will see then, of course, after looking at this in this week, what's going to happen next week with 11.0.5 coming and having multiple changes to many specs. We had the video about it on what's going to be changing for some of the specs, like the mages being changed, enhancement and elemental shaman being changed, balanced druid, BM hunter and dark ranger for hunter as a whole. We mentioned who is bound to receive more changes from the patch, so now all that's left is to wait the release of the patch and then see how many of the changes will actually impact in a visible manner the performance of the specs in the raid. So for today, this was the preview of the state of the specs before the patch launches. So we can now, on this Thursday, leave each other. We're starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, but also for supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I did not notice because I was talking for the video, but we started with pouring rain and we ended with silence.
Dead old man.
Yes, man. Fuck.